Well, good morning, and thank you for the opportunity to speak to you this morning. I'd like to acknowledge my ministerial colleague, the Honourable Paul Goldsmith, and your chairman, Chris Black, and thank you, Chris, for those very kind comments. I must at some point introduce you and require you to have a long conversation with John Campbell and many other media commentators in this country. Over the past 5 years, New Zealanders, I think, have seen the huge value in having insurance against natural disasters. There's no doubt in my mind that insurance is an essential part of any modern economy. A point I think that's now well understood by most New Zealanders, much more widely than it was before the events in Christchurch. This country has absorbed an impact of about 20% of GDP from the Canterbury earthquakes without having to impose additional taxes or levies and without cutting important public services because of the good insurance cover that New Zealanders had in place. Just to put that in perspective, the biggest natural disaster event in the world was Hurricane Katrina, which represented just over 2.5% of US GDP. So we've had a very big shock factor here. With a small population and exposure to almost every natural hazard that you could possibly imagine, we've also seen great value from our combined private and public residential insurance model. In the wake of the Canterbury earthquakes, we're making government offers to purchase damaged residential red zone land. We were pleased to discover that more than 98% of the affected parties had insurance. That is a very, very deep penetration rate for insurance. And that meant that as we've gone through the repair program, almost every home in Canterbury that had a claim on it or had some damage, I should say, came in contact with some form of insurance and was able to call on their protection. And that's a remarkable and I think unique internationally a figure like that, particularly with the scale of the disaster we were dealing with. So the importance of keeping insurance affordable and available, as Chris has just said, for all by reducing risks is well demonstrated, I think, also by the Lloyd's analysis, which calculated that for every 1% increase in insurance penetration, there is a 22% decrease in the taxpayer contribution required post-disaster. In New Zealand's case, about 75 to 80% of losses arising from Canterbury are being met from insurer and reinsurance balance sheets. The balance will largely come from the taxpayer, but will generally be where the taxpayer has chosen to reinsure itself for public type buildings. The Earthquake Commission, as you know, provides first loss cover for damage to residential homes from earthquakes, natural landslips, volcanic eruption, hydrothermic activity, tsunami or fire caused from any of those natural disasters. As private insurers, you provide residential cover above the capped EQC cover, and this arrangement was put in place in 1993 at a time when New Zealand was becoming more aware of the risks that we live with, and private insurers at that time less willing to take all that risk alone. This arrangement has kept natural hazard insurance affordable for homeowners and created a viable residential insurance market for insurers and reinsurers. So we have become something of an international example of the value of a holistic approach to natural hazard risk, and I'll soon talk more about that. It's fair to say that the value of EQC cover has been well demonstrated, and there is considerable international interest in the role insurance has played in the Canterbury rebuild and will play beyond that. Internationally, private markets for catastrophe insurance tend to be marked by low rates of insurance uptake and fluctuations in supply of this type of cover. The result is significant levels of underinsurance and in many cases non-insurance among property owners. For example, only about 10% of Californian homeowners have earthquake insurance, despite California being a very seismically active part of the world. In Japan, 25 to 30% of homeowners have earthquake insurance. And it's worth for a minute just to reflect on the position that Canterbury homeowners and the government, and therefore the wider New Zealand tax base, would have been in if only 30% or less of earthquake-affected homes had insurance compared to the 98% who did. That doesn't mean that we haven't seen some room for improvement. And as you're aware, Treasury is leading a review of New Zealand's future natural disaster insurance cover, which currently comes under the Earthquake Commission Act of 1993. Many of you in this room have made submissions on this review, and I thank you for taking the time to do so. I know considerable thought has gone into the views that you've put forward, and they are being well considered. In fact, there were 60 submissions to the review discussion document. That may not seem like a large number, but the quality of those submissions is very high. And of these, about half are from organisations and half from individuals with specialist knowledge ranging from academics to industry practitioners. And there is clear support for retaining the broad structure of the co-insurance model, with the EQC acting as the first loss insurer, but with a raised cap. Submitters also identified difficulties associated with interaction between land and building cover. I think we can all agree that this is an area where things could be improved. There was also near consensus that EQC should no longer offer contents insurance, and on both of these points the government strongly agrees. It's important to note that EQC's mandate goes wider, however, than running an insurance scheme and maintaining the New Zealand Natural Disaster Fund to mitigate any financial impact from natural disasters on homeowners. As a public entity, EQC takes a holistic approach to natural hazard risk, which includes funding research into understanding and reducing New Zealand's vulnerability to natural disasters, and public education to reduce the impacts of natural disasters on individuals and communities. Many submitters saw that work as valuable and want EQC to continue doing it. We agree, and EQC will be keeping those roles. Knowledge about New Zealand's natural disasters and potential hazards informs pricing of New Zealand risk by international reinsurance companies. Any information held by the government through any of its agencies is available to anyone who wants to see it, who are involved in that risk analysis. And as private insurers, that will be of benefit to you as well. Submitters have expressed concerns about the proposal to change EQC's building cover to include site works and have made alternative proposals. The insurance industry will be consulted continually through the review process on this and other issues raised in submissions. And I know there is support for insurers managing EQC claims beyond the claims lodgement point, and for this to be made explicit in the legislation. As you may be aware, it's already possible under the current Act for EQC and insurers to reach such an agreement. There were proposals around this in 2012, and there were small attempts at it. But I have to say I remain cautious about this. In the days immediately following the September 4, 2010 and February 11, 2011 events, there was a need for some very clear indication that claims would be dealt with competently and expeditiously as possible. Despite the views of some media commentators, I think EQC did a very good job of organising large assessment teams, a repair program that created confidence that equity would be maintained for homeowners and inflation would not run away to the predicted high levels for the rest of the country. Taking hold of the repair program was important, and I'm not keen to legislate in a way that would possibly see that a more diffused arrangement should we ever have such a big event again. That said, I do believe there is need for more collaboration between EQC and private insurers to ensure that the best results across events of different sizes and types deliver a better claims experience for homeowners and better support the recovery of affected communities. As we've seen in Canterbury, a lot hinges on assessment of natural hazard damage by assessors on behalf of insurers. The EQC reforms are designed to ensure the scheme remains focused on insuring homes, resolves the difficulties experienced in Canterbury with the interaction of land and building cover, which I've just spoken of, better integrates EQC and private insurer claims handling processes with the caveats I've mentioned, and ensures that the ongoing financial stability of the scheme itself. Agreement on how all of this can be best achieved we would like to see in place well in advance of any future natural hazard event, although, as you well know, that can't be predicted. I'd like to, the work that's currently in progress, to be at a point where I can introduce a new bill to the House early next year with a view to passing any changes into law after the appropriate select committee process and seeing that all completed by the end of 2016. New Zealand hasn't been alone in recovering from devastating natural disasters in the last 5 years. The number of large-scale events globally, there is increasing international recognition and awareness of the role that insurance and reinsurance markets play in supporting disaster risk reduction. Earlier this year, I attended the 3rd United Nations Conference on Disaster Risk Reduction in Sendai, Japan. There, the Sendai Declaration was agreed by the heads of state and government ministers and delegates. The declaration, implemented through the Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction 2015-2030, endorsed by the UN General Assembly, is something now that we will be participating and working on. The Sendai Framework has 4 priorities for action to prevent new and reduce existing disaster risks. These priorities are understanding disaster risk firstly, strengthening disaster risk governance and to manage disaster risk, investing in disaster risk for resilience, and enhancing disaster preparedness for effective response to build back better in recovery, rehabilitation and reconstruction. I made it clear to the conference that New Zealand could only sign off on the framework if insurance was included as a tool to reduce financial impact of disasters on both governments and communities. It surprised me that this is the first time the word insurance has appeared in such a framework document. So under priority 3 now of that document, there is a statement that says public and private investment in disaster risk prevention and reduction through structural and non-structural measures are essential to enhance the economic, social, health and cultural resilience of persons, communities, countries and their assets, as well as the environment. These can be drivers of innovation, growth and job creation. Such measures are cost-effective and instrumental to save lives, prevent reduce losses and ensure effective recovery and rehabilitation. Specifically, it goes on to say to promote mechanisms for disaster risk transfer, insurance, risk sharing and retention of financial protection is appropriate for both public-private investment in order to reduce the financial impact of disasters on governments and societies in urban rural areas. Now that was a large, long statement written by 400 people and I think everyone got one word in that particular comment. My word was insurance. In signing up to this agreement, New Zealand has both domestic and international obligations. Outside New Zealand, our key disaster risk reduction focus is on the Pacific countries, followed by Southeast Asia. Our Pacific Island neighbours are among the world's most vulnerable to natural hazards like tropical cyclones, earthquakes, tsunamis and volcanic activity. In the Pacific, natural disasters have resulted in enormous losses and disastrous economic and human and environmental consequences which follow. For several of these countries, the total monetary losses caused by natural disasters in the past 50 years have been several times higher than their individual GDP. As part of the international donor community, New Zealand will continue to work with government, non-government, regional and multilateral partners to prioritise practical activities that will help countries and communities to better withstand impacts of disaster to recover more quickly. Just to explain what that all meant, we see the prospect of using a small percentage of aid money that goes into Pacific and other parts of the world to build natural disaster funds, but also to cover those funds with some either annualised or long-term insurance cover, however that might take shape. It's worth noting that New Zealand contributes over a 4-year period something in the vicinity of $1.7 billion to Pacific aid. Australia would be several times that. The European Union, a multiple more of that, and then the US sitting somewhere alongside the EU contribution. So when you think about all that money going in to try and boost those countries, build up their infrastructure, etc. It's just staggering to me that there isn't a small percentage set aside to provide good cover in the event of a natural disaster. And the other point I'd make is that by doing that, you're almost certainly going to build in a higher level of resilience to those projects as a natural consequence of understanding the cost of losing them. In New Zealand, the Sendai framework is proving influential, and under development are a program of work to better understand the range of risks that New Zealand faces, including drivers of those risks. A national resilience strategy is being developed, and a government's arrangement for disaster risk reduction is also soon to be in place. All these are formative stages, but are intended to proceed with a government-led and whole-of-society approach in keeping the Sendai framework alive. It's important that the private sector remains actively involved in this work, giving valuable insights and access to information and data where possible. I think some of you have already been involved in events such as the Built Environment Leaders Forum in September, organised by EQC, the Ministry of Business, Innovation and Employment, and the Building Research Association of New Zealand. On the subject of data and information sharing, this has been one of the successes of our lessons learned from Canterbury. EQC has captured a lot of data, informing information and evidence to inform better asset management and land use and infrastructure planning. And that's been centralised in the Canterbury Geotechnical Database with information from other sources to give a big picture of the overall understanding of land damaged and damage caused by earthquakes, which is required for recovery, as well as property-specific information for insurance purposes. Probably the most extensive study of any particular large land mass anywhere in the world. And that will, I think, eventually lead to the possibility of more granular decisions about the levels of insurance cover. But I wouldn't encourage you to get there too quickly. We're quite enjoying the premium mix that's out there at the present time, given some of the awful predictions that were around a few years ago. The EQC has led international research and programs around Canterbury, particularly in ground improvement. And the ground improvement program was launched last week, which has identified affordable and practical solutions to improve or strengthen residential vulnerable land to liquefaction. The science behind this has informed building regulations for Canterbury, and this information will be applicable anywhere in the world with similar geological conditions. As many of you know, the Canterbury Earthquake Recovery legislation expires in April next year, 5 years after it was initially passed. In October this year, the Greater Christchurch Regeneration Bill was introduced to the House and received its first reading. I'm pleased to say that that bill, just like the Canterbury Earthquake Recovery Bill, received unanimous support in the House. The new bill will enable the government to work in a unique collaboration with local leadership organisations to ensure regeneration of the region beyond emergency response, beyond the recovery response, will have a clear future focus. When we passed the CER Act in 2011, we were responding to a natural disaster with significant loss of life and massive damage to houses, commercial buildings, and critically to infrastructure. As the government, we urgently needed to find ways to help thousands of people who had their lives turned upside down. But almost 5 years on, it's time for this form of extraordinary legislation to be replaced so that we can look at a new phase of the rebuild. We've moved on from emergency and recovery to a time of regeneration, and this needs to be appropriately reflected. The bill will allow the government to continue the process of stepping back and enabling local leadership to take more control of planning and decision-making required for regeneration. The bill allows for the preparation of regeneration plans, which will become statutory documents setting out directions and details for addressing the regeneration of requirements of particular areas of Greater Christchurch. The bill reflects the draft transition recovery plan released in July, which set out proposals for new legislation and invited public comment. It was developed in consultation with the Advisory Board on Transition and central government agencies, along with strategic partners. And their advice is clearly reflected in the Greater Christchurch Regeneration Bill. I also consider the written comments made by the public on that draft transition plan, and those also have been largely reflected in the new legislation. The bill will establish a new organisation, Regenerate Christchurch, which will focus on regeneration of specific areas in the city, not necessarily connected to earthquake recovery, initially those areas will be the central city and residential zones as required, and in particular an area called New Brighton. Regenerate Christchurch will be jointly run by the Crown and Christchurch City Council and will exist until June of 2021, after which time it will transition to being a solely council-controlled organisation. An independent board of 7 will oversee Regenerate Christchurch, with 3 members each initially appointed by the Crown and the Council, and 1 appointed following consultation with Te Runanga or Ngaitahu. We've achieved, I think, over the last 5 years, a significant amount of progress in Christchurch and its outlying areas. Progress which would have been impossible without the Act of Parliament. The Greater Christchurch Regeneration Bill enables collaboration in a form that's not been proposed anywhere else in New Zealand, but which will, I think, end up providing a template for other areas dealing with the challenges of a changing society. So I look forward to working with our strategic partners, the City Council, Waimak District, Selwyn, Environment Canterbury and Ngaitahu, as we continue to work with the private sector to create a vibrant, regenerated Christchurch. In conclusion, as I said at the beginning, insurance is an important component of any economy. There are many, many good stories that have come out of the disaster in Canterbury, entirely due to insurance and your industry. But perhaps the most important future-focused insurance lesson for consumers is to read your policies. And I know so that people know what they're covered for and to know how that cover triggers. In that regard, I am a little concerned to see the move to some insured residential cover is better understood by households. Brokers, I think, also have a very important role in ensuring that people are well educated in what they are signing up to and end up making good decisions. So may I thank you for your contribution to New Zealand's economy, to the recovery of Christchurch, and for the opportunity to speak to you today. As a final message, I think the insurance industry has performed extremely well in Christchurch. There will always be stories about someone feeling aggrieved for some reason or another. And as a claimant, I can tell you that we never ever feel we're just quite right in the way we settle, but overall the result has been fantastic, and I think a huge tribute to the industry that you're in. So I wish you well for the rest of the day. Thank you for the opportunity to speak to you. I think we've got to have some questions in a few minutes.
All right, the Minister has indicated he will take a couple of questions, so we do have some roving microphones. Is there anyone wishing to pose a question? There must be some cantabs out there who will just be itching the chance to pose a question at this stage. No? All right, Mr. Here's one for you. Insurers, that's come from ICNZ, insurers have submitted that the lodgement and assessment of future disaster claims should be made directly with the insurer. What are your views on the merits of that proposal?
Well, as I said, I've got some reservations, but I do know that Treasury and EQC, there's a team of people that are working on the future shape of all this, are working very closely with ICC, I hope, to work out all the wrinkles that might exist around that. I don't think we should set up an organisation that precludes different courses of action for different events. The size of Christchurch, I think, was not well understood after September 4, and I think if we'd done anything else after the February 11 event, we'd be further away from some of the good results we've got in the community than we are now. And I've had the opportunity to look at other disasters, Sendai in Japan and Hurricane Katrina. We're 5 years in. Sendai is 5 years in. There are still large numbers of people living in temporary homes who will probably never ever get out of them. And similarly in Louisiana, Mississippi, where is it? Sorry, where's it? New Orleans. They're 10 years down the track and still really struggling. And they've had a multiplicity of organisations that have tried to fix things and made no progress. The key thing for me, though, is in all this is that let's get too hung up on who does what when at this early stage. Have a bill that creates a degree of flexibility. There's no doubt that the failure to make greater progress in those other jurisdictions is largely because of the lack of insurance.
And just finally, when do you see the Christchurch rebuild, particularly of the CBD, being completed? Because there are estimates that could be still more than a decade away. Do you have a greater sense about when the CBD rebuild particularly will be complete?
Yeah, well, look, in Christchurch at the moment there are vast open spaces where 1,200 buildings have been removed. There's a huge amount of construction going on. A lot of new stuff will be opened in the next couple of years. A lot of that will happen, probably on a monthly basis next year. But if you think about it, you take 1,000 buildings and you replace them. Even if you replace them only because you're going to have different configurations, you're only replacing, say, 600 buildings, and you could open one a month, then it's 600 months. It's a long, long time. So I don't like putting timelines on these things. I think also there are a lot of buildings around the city that have survived, but eventually their economic worth will be questioned because of the code condition and because there's so much new stuff available. So we've seized on this word regeneration because I think Christchurch is going to go into that sort of phase for quite an extended period of time. That's a perfect example of a politician giving you a complete non-answer to a very specific question.
Yes, sure.
Minister, on behalf of our industry, I'd like to say thank you for the work you've done behind the scenes that's often not recognised in terms of the international work. And I remember in 2011 when you went to Monte Carlo to really understand, and I think behind the scenes you've taken a lot of care to understand the complexity of any system as you've outlined. But just one thing that's emerging, I think, if we put earthquake aside, is the climate change issue, and the World Bank released a very detailed report on the impact of climate change on poverty and inequality around the world, and that if climate change continues at its rate, it actually means that all the work that's done on improving poverty will actually come back by 2% in the next 10 years, just through climate change alone. And I picked up your comment about aid and the Pacific, but I guess we've got some problems here in New Zealand as well if people drop out of insurance and the safety net's not there for them. I mean, is there any particular work being linked to the work that your government is doing on inequality in New Zealand?
Yeah, well, you just asked a question that ranges across about 20 ministerial portfolios, but I'll do my best to give you an answer, possibly similar to the one I just gave before. But I think the first thing is we take climate change pretty seriously. As a government, we introduced emissions trading scheme and various other things. We've got some clear targets, and those targets will be, well, I better put it this way, there'll be more comment about those targets when there's at the conference in Paris at the end of this month. So our risks around that, around sea level rise, etc. I think you've got to be a little bit, I'm not a skeptic, but I am cautious. So if you go back to 1987, there was a prediction about what the sea level rise would be around New Zealand over the next 50 years. So from 87 was sort of roughly just over the halfway mark. And where the sea level rise was sort of predicted to be in the vicinity of, and please don't hold me to this because I'm not the science minister, so let's just say, for example, it was 70 millimetres. It's actually so far around about 3.5. And then when you get to 3.5, it's sort of in the zone of, it's plus or minus. So I think we've got to be careful about that. Prepare for it, but be careful. I think, though, the Pacific does have some serious issues, and we'll have to work through those internationally over a long period of time. But your question about whether climate change is going to cause people to opt out of insurance or insurance not to be available, is that what you're saying, not available? Or?
It's more an issue about if households who are most at risk don't buy insurance, and also when we look at our migration patterns, if we've got people coming into the country that from their own home country haven't been buying insurance, does that put at risk our economy more with a rising risk of weather events? I mean, we've seen a rising risk of weather events in the last year, and then that pushes more into an inequality issue that's also trying to be addressed.
Yeah, I think
broadly.
the saving here, though, is that very few people can get a mortgage without insurance on their properties, and I don't see that disappearing. I don't think banks are going to want to just transfer risk to themselves. And the other thing I'd make a comment on is that most new immigrants to New Zealand, despite what people think, don't come in here with large pots of cash, able to sort of buy up, property, etc., without some sort of a lending arrangement backing them. So I think that will continue. I don't have that same fear of that. But as I did mention in my speech, do fear that people may not adequately insure. And the other thing would be that in those areas where there is the greatest potential for vulnerability, it will depend on how much cover is available. And it goes back to that general comment, we've got to know more to understand our risk so that the calculations about insurance price are informed on good science and both parties can be comfortable that they're getting a good deal.